I want to also offer a word of thanks to the Paulist Reconciliation Ministries and the School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College for the invitation to be with you during this symposium around the very exciting topic of the road to reconciliation. There are three commemorations being held this year that make the theme, the road to reconciliation, especially timely. In November, we will mark 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, an event emblematic of the collapse of communism in Europe. It was perhaps this event, more than anything else, that set off a renewed and intense interest in reconciliation. While the theme of reconciliation had been explored intermittently in the decades before, much of the advances in our understanding of reconciliation can be traced back to what happened in Berlin and throughout Eastern and Central Europe in those days. The undoing of 40 years of repression, in many instances a repression that was built upon a prior history of fascism, seemed a daunting task then, and as we know, continues to be so today. 2009, this year, has also been designated by the United Nations as the International Year of Reconciliation. This proclamation was prompted by the awareness that protracted armed conflict had devastated and continues to devastate so much of the world. A renewed effort to overcome the trauma of war and to build a different kind of society, both locally and globally, seems a particularly apt undertaking at the end of the first decade of this 21st century. Focused more closely on a single continent, a third event brings the theme of reconciliation into the foreground of our attention. In October of this year, the Second Special Synod for Africa will be celebrated in Rome. Its theme is the Church in service to reconciliation, justice, and peace. The Lineamenta and Instrumentum Laboris both recognized how poverty, exploitation, and war have colluded to make contemporary Africa anything but a site of justice or a haven of peace. What is especially significant from a church perspective is that the Instrumentum Laboris appears to take the theme of reconciliation beyond its more traditional theological boundaries of sin and penitence. All in all, a good time to be sojourners on the road to reconciliation, as this symposium is intended to be. So I want to thank, once again, the Paulist Reconciliation Ministries and the School of Theology and Ministry of Boston College for staging this very timely symposium and inviting me to be a part of it. The Road to Reconciliation, its title, as a metaphor, suggests that we are indeed on the move and that there is a certain directionality in our movement. I would like to take this road metaphor and use it to pose two questions. The first is, just where have we come on the road to reconciliation? Taking the International Year of Reconciliation as an opportunity and invitation, I would like to take stock of where we have come and what we have learned over these past 20 years about reconciliation. The learning curve has been a steep one in many ways, both in the sheer number of events that have called out for reconciliation and in the density of questions that have emerged from these events. Much of this presentation tonight, therefore, will be given over to charting the road to reconciliation as it has unfolded before us over the past 20 years. The second question is contained in the title that I've given to this presentation. Is the road to reconciliation principally about looking backward, healing the past, or looking forward, building towards the future? Responding to this question will require a different perspective from the one needed to answer the previous one. It will involve stepping aside, as it were, and trying to locate the multiple discourses of reconciliation within the larger landscape of the last 2 decades. Why did reconciliation emerge as such a compelling topic when it did? What does it say about what preceded it and what we hope will follow? At the very end of this presentation, I'll devote some time to this question but we'll be taking it up in more detail tomorrow. As can be seen from the breadth of these two questions, all I'm going to be able to do here this evening is point to the signposts along the road and not give any thorough treatment of any specific topic. While there's a measure of frustration built into such approach, this attempt to grasp the big picture has the advantage of offering a wider perspective that might help us address some of the thorny issues involved in reconciliation and perhaps throw some light on puzzlements we experience along the way. So let me begin. Where have we come on the road to reconciliation? Map is not territory. Religion scholar Jonathan Z. Smith reminded us already many years ago. A map is an attempt to understand better a terrain and the relationships between its various parts. A road map is not the map itself, but a stylized representation that is intended to help us navigate a road's twists and turns, its smooth and its rough parts. Before embarking on tracing the road to reconciliation, however, it behooves us to consider a bit the territory itself, the territory that has created the need to chart roads to reconciliation. I've already noted that there was a dramatic increase in events that drew attention to the theme of reconciliation. Just what were those events, and how do they engage this theme of reconciliation in those years? Let me trace briefly some of those events and how they provide the contour and texture of the landscape of what we look for in reconciliation. I've already mentioned what might be considered the inaugurating event of that period, namely the end of communism in the countries in East and Central Europe, symbolized in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The relatively rapid collapse of a whole political and economic order had two seismic effects. First of all, it opened the possibility for the reconstruction of nation-states and their societies now freed from an imposed Marxist-Leninist ideology. The species Homo Sovieticus, the new man, as it was called at the time, of the workers' paradise, had turned out to be a very hollow figure, lacking the capacity to build a cohesive, vibrant society. The surveillance and terror tactics of state security police had undermined the basic trust needed to have a thriving civil society. The lies that had been proffered as the truth needed to be named and counteracted. Those who had been declared enemies of the state needed to be rehabilitated. All in all, there was a daunting menu of issues that needed addressing before those nation-states could gain some measure of normalcy. Second, the second seismic shift, the shifting away from the bipolar geopolitical order, allowed a whole series of local conflicts to erupt. Some of these were long-simmering ones, bearing the marks still of the European colonial era. Others were efforts to gain autonomy as nation-states. In the Balkans, in parts of the former Soviet Union, as well as in Africa and Asia, conflicts surged through the 1990s. What was striking about nearly all of them was that they were armed conflicts within states rather than between them. Peacemaking that entails reinforcing borders was already a familiar solution. But what did peacemaking mean when there were no physical borders and erstwhile enemies lived next door to one another? The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 became emblematic of the human consequences of such conflicts. But there were other events that contributed to the interest in reconciliation. 1992 was the United Nations International Year of Indigenous Peoples, marking the 500th anniversary of the arrival of the Europeans in North America, in the Americas. This prompted native peoples of that hemisphere, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, and some of the Pacific Islands, to set before the world the dehumanizing effects of a half a millennium of colonialism and cultural destruction. How to acknowledge and then address these issues, how to think of possible reparations, and how to restore dignity and honor to devastated cultures took on an awareness and an urgency not previously known. 1994 was the UN's International Year of the Woman, marked by a world conference in Beijing. What this event prompted was a new focus on the plight of women and of children around the world. Violence, especially domestic violence, against women and children, human trafficking, and discrimination against women who could no longer be treated as a taboo subject. Domestic violence, physical and sexual, was present in every society and every class. Yet another prominent theme of reconciliation in those years arose out of the end of other kinds of repressive governments. In this case, not communist ones, but avowedly anti-communist security states. The end of these governments in Latin America had gained momentum in the 1980s, but the response to their violent past was usually one of amnesty and impunity for the wrongdoers. Truth commissions, as an alternate to a war crimes tribunal, had been proposed and were sometimes enacted in many countries, reaching as far back already as Bangladesh in the 1970s. But it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were convened first in Chile and thereafter most dramatically in South Africa that caught the world's imagination. Imperfect as TRCs have been, they seem to address in some measure the need to set the historic record straight about what had happened, to allow those who had been silenced to speak, and to propose to the successor governments some measures of redress. Today, hardly any conflict ends without a call for such a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although the conditions under which they can be effective are actually relatively narrow. They have come to be in the minds of many one of the few remedies we have to heal wounded pasts. Two final occurrences that have contributed to the atmosphere of a search for reconciliation deserve mention, one general and one more localized and specific. The general one can be found in the multiple effects of globalization. Alongside its many benefits are a host of negative consequences. The human cost of migration and the plight of migrants are most noticeable. Not that there were not migrants before, but globalization has changed the conditions under which they live. The economic downturn we are now experiencing has some of its most severe effects on those who did the least to cause it. The way wealth is generated and distributed in the global market causes division and polarization. And in the media, the very contrastive nature of how information is transmitted plays into the hands of demagogues and divisive figures. The fact, too, that news transmission is now constant means that conflicts found anywhere are reported everywhere. In the midst of this flood of information, images, and relentless demands for attention, we are discovering that much of our communications media is having a markedly paradoxical effect on the social fabric. Rather than connecting us to one another, we find it dividing us. People are retreating into enclaves of the like-minded and are actually being insulated from pluralism rather than being engaged by it. The polarizing rhetoric that marks so much of the first decade of this century is a result. Part of the appeal of the Obama presidential campaign for many was the possibility that we might just be able to overcome this pounding polarization. The other area that has impelled people to seek reconciliation is the state of the Roman Catholic Church in this country. The sexual abuse scandals that began to be reported in 2001 and here in Boston are emblematic of this. Now, it's interesting that a similar wave of sexual abuse had been reported 10 years earlier, but had not had the same social impact. The anger, alienation, and erosion of trust that the more recent reports evoked come now upon the accumulated anger and alienation caused by a host of other issues besetting the church. To be sure, some of these are shared with other Christian churches as well, regarding authority, teaching, sexuality, identity. As I understand it, it's precisely these divisive issues that the Paulist reconciliation ministries feel called especially to address. I've given this extensive list of deep wounds, long-standing grievances, senses of violation, and ruptures of trust to give some idea of the terrain that roads to reconciliation attempt to negotiate. Rebuilding shattered lives, communities, and nations, assuring safety in the most intimate of settings, redressing long-standing crimes against culture and race. All of these have converged, as it were, to create an atmosphere that makes us look to reconciliation as a way through so much pain, suffering, dislocation, and lost opportunities. What the last 2 decades have done, both for long-standing grievances and misdeeds committed more recently, is create an expectation that something can be done to right all the wrongs that have been perpetrated against individuals, communities, and entire nations. As I look over the terrain that we are being called to traverse, I can discern 3 roadmaps to reconciliation that have been traced across this territory in the past 20 years. In each of these roadmaps, we learn something about reconciliation itself. We can see how the resources, and I'm going to focus here especially on the resources of Christian faith, help us negotiate what is often rugged and unforgiving terrain. But we will also see where those roadmaps fall short, where they miscalculate the steep grade that needs to be climbed to attain reconciliation, where they encounter chasms of alienation and suffering that they simply cannot bridge. So let me turn to them now. The first roadmap. Reconciliation is about the human heart. The first roadmap sees reconciliation achieved principally by a conversion of the human heart. Only when we have changed the individuals in a society will there be any hope of changing society itself. Put another way, it is reconciled individuals who will make a reconciled society. On this view, reconciliation is not something we do, but rather something that God is doing to us. This is certainly the central point of St. Paul's message of reconciliation, our principal source for thinking about a Christian theology of reconciliation. As he sets forth eloquently in the 5th chapter of the letter to the Romans, we are reconciled to God because, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Paul reminds us here and elsewhere that all reconciliation comes from God. And this reconciliation not only frees us from alienation from God, one another, and the entire cosmos, it also makes of us a new creation, something utterly transformed. Such a so-called vertical understanding of reconciliation, that is, the relationship between God and all that God has created, has been and continues to be at the very heart of the Church's teaching on reconciliation. It focuses upon how individual wrongdoers are reconciled to their Creator. Liturgical texts and practices of reconciliation in the Church all give expression to this teaching. While such an approach to reconciliation is, for Christians, incontrovertible, it is often difficult to find ways of translating it into horizontal reconciliation, that is, reconciliation among human beings at both the individual and the collective level. Here, there is a focus in horizontal reconciliation on beginning with the victim and the healing of victims rather than on the conversion of the perpetrator. While Christians believe that it is only God who has the perspicacity to comprehend the enormity of evil and the consequences of evil doing, the emphasis on the repentance of the wrongdoer runs into the fact that, in human realities, wrongdoers often do not and will not repent. That's what got me thinking about reconciliation in the first place. It's worth telling the story. 1986, I was giving lectures in Chile, and General Pinochet, the dictator in the country, announced there would be a plebiscite on his rule because the economy had improved and he thought people would overlook the fact that he had killed about 3,000 people in order to bring about this new era. The bishops immediately proclaimed a new pastoral plan that there would be reconciliation in truth. And since I was from more than 500 miles away, therefore an expert, I was asked to speak on reconciliation, which I dutifully did, but did a terrible job of. I just basically repeated platitudes. And afterwards, a young priest came up to me, looked me in the eye, and I knew him. He had been very active in the resistance against Pinochet in his part of Santiago, a very poor part of the city. And he says, "How do you reconcile with people who don't think they've done anything wrong?" And that is the dilemma that faces looking at vertical reconciliation. Where does that leave the victims if the wrongdoers do not repent? A more victim-centered approach to reconciliation is, of course, possible within the framework of Christian faith, and much effort has been given over to trying to articulate that in the last decade and a half. The option for the poor and the accompaniment of those who are marginalized, as exemplified in the message of the Hebrew prophets and in the praxis of Jesus, provide an ample base. Much recent effort in developing a theology of reconciliation has been exploring these possibilities. Yet to date, there has been little liturgical support for the care of victims. The apologies of Pope John Paul II, offered within the context of evening prayer on the first Sunday of Lent in 2000, are at least a harbinger of what might still come. The Instrumentum Laboris for the upcoming Synod for Africa on reconciliation gives a very good summary of this first road to reconciliation, based on the conversion of human hearts. Although it encourages acts of advocacy, charity, and education, it centers on the sacraments and the growth and holiness of individuals as the key to reconciliation in Africa. There is a deep truth here. Without a cadre of truly reconciled individuals, one cannot hope to transform a society. As an example, one can speculate what the end of the apartheid era might have looked like were it not for the vision of Nelson Mandela and the way Desmond Tutu led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But at the same time, focusing only on the state of grace of individuals does not begin to reach far enough in the huge problems that Africa faces today, problems that are acknowledged in the Instrumentum Laboris, but barely addressed under the theme of reconciliation. To focus solely on individual conversion and union with God is an essential part of any road to reconciliation from a Christian perspective, but by itself fails to account for other important features. A society is more than the sum of individuals, and what is called social or structural sin cannot be reduced to the accumulated sins of individuals. To speak of reconciliation only in terms of individual conversion does not adequately deal with the kind of society that needs to emerge from conversion. The flawed character of a view of reconciliation focused only on individuals has been evident for a long time in the ecclesial and educational ministries of the Church. Regular reception of the sacraments and a Catholic education do not inoculate a society against evil practices. The majority of the genocidaires in Rwanda, after all, were Christian, and most of them Catholic. To make the same point in more individual terms, advising a battered spouse to solve the problem of being beaten by praying more and forgiving her spouse does not solve the problem of domestic violence. Some demons may be driven out by prayer and fasting, but others are not. Put another way, the tangled roots of violence and wrongdoing cannot be reduced to individual sin, even though sin is undeniably a part of the equation. More pastorally, the sole focus on the human heart is likely to sound like advice to endure one's suffering rather than work in some way to overcome it. So as a road to reconciliation, to see reconciliation only as something about the individual human heart will not in itself get us to our goal. To put it perhaps in more philosophical language, the conversion of the individual heart is a necessary but not sufficient condition for reconciliation. It provides an important, indeed indispensable resource, and is an important feature for orientation on the road to reconciliation. But we need more. Which brings me to the second roadmap. A second roadmap to achieve reconciliation takes a different approach, building somewhat on the perceived shortcomings of the first roadmap. This second approach tries to address the complexity of causes that create situations that call for reconciliation. It focuses especially on social factors and their accumulated historical effects upon a situation. It tries to discern how different forms of wrongdoing become intertwined and become over time nearly impossible to untangle. In conflict transformation language, this is called nesting, where one problem nests in another, and they keep going down. They're like Marushka dolls. You know, you take the head off the Marushka doll, there's another Marushka doll inside. Take the head off that one, there's another one inside. So this is what I'm talking about. In nations, histories of colonialism or foreign subjugation are kept in place by endemic poverty and protracted conflict. Among the countries experiencing conflict in the world today, intrastate conflict, according to the best estimates, within 5 years, half of them after peace will have new conflict. So this becomes built into the situations. Institutions intended to be, the dysfunctional families, to take another example, dysfunctional systems in families can affect family members for generation after generation. We know that dysfunction can be transmitted. Institutions intended to be benevolent develop repressive and oppressive features that become embedded in their culture. In a word, there are glaring absences of right relations we call injustice. The road to reconciliation in this second roadmap is construed as a struggle against injustice. A cry that is often heard in the aftermath of repression in a country is that there can be no reconciliation without an end to injustice and indeed a punishment of wrongdoers. As I move around in different settings, when people start saying there can be no reconciliation until, we're usually working out of this roadmap. I was in the Philippines in Mindanao in January, and right in the middle of one of the conflict zones. And this is the language I heard constantly. But I said, do you think we can really end all of this? So does this mean we shouldn't even be talking about reconciliation? I'll come back to this point. Pope Paul VI's oft-quoted dictum, if you want peace, work for justice, sums this up succinctly. Especially since the 1970 Synod of Bishops on Justice in the World and parallel efforts in the World Council of Churches beginning about the same time, the work for reconciliation has often focused on the work for justice. As well it should. The language of reconciliation often also can be found on the lips of wrongdoers who want victims to forget the past and the sufferings that they as victims have endured. It is a way of skipping over the issue of justice. The use of amnesty and impunity in Latin America in the 1980s made reconciliation a bad word in many of those countries. Till recently, you couldn't even use the word in Argentina. Justice is clearly understood for us as one of the central attributes of God and is manifested as such in all three of the Abrahamic faiths. The Bible, and the Quran for that matter, is filled with references to justice. Without some measure of justice, the wounds of those who have suffered injustice cannot heal. Without the continuing pursuit of justice, efforts and programs that call themselves reconciliation will not have authenticity in the eyes of victims. But more important even here than the authenticity that makes for our credibility is a faithfulness to God and to God's own work in reconciliation. And that work is inconceivable without a continuing pursuit of justice. At the same time, 20 years in the work of reconciliation has taught us a few things about the pursuit of justice, especially what might be called our pursuit of justice as compared to perhaps God's pursuit of justice. There are three things in particular that we have learned that need to be mentioned here. The first is that when justice focuses exclusively on punitive justice, that is, the punishment of wrongdoers, it is inadequate at best and can become deleterious to the entire process of reconciliation and healing at worst. The punishment of wrongdoers serves a deeply felt human impulse that evolutionary psychologists at the moment are studying particularly, because this response, this retaliation, is among the basic of what they call adaptive responses that have shaped human social behavior since we lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers in the later Pleistocene era. When we retaliate when we have been harmed. Retaliation is intended to deter the wrongdoer from striking again and fits into a larger social pattern that sees society as an equilibrium among competing hostile forces. So, in many Western societies, this primitive adaptive response is often depicted as Dame Justice holding a set of scales, herself blindfolded, to indicate her impartiality in restoring balance in society. Sociologists studying Western societies have cast considerable doubt on whether punishment for the sake of deterrence actually does create the hoped-for block on future wrongful behavior. Yet it remains an important mechanism, at the very least, for maintaining, as Max Weber pointed out, the state's claim to monopoly on violence in society. From the point of view of reconciliation, punitive justice runs the risk of not actually stopping cycles of violence, but merely sending them underground into gestation until the opportunity arises for the punished to retaliate against those doing the punishing. Perhaps one of the most graphic examples of this at a social level in the 20th century was the punishment meted out against Germany by the Allies at the end of the First World War. The heavy fines, the wresting away of territory, and the military occupation of the Rhineland was intended to punish and to humiliate. Many historians consider this experience as having prepared the ground for accepting fascism in that country, in Germany, so much so that recent histories now of the early 20th century suggest that the 20 years between 1919 and 1939 were actually only a truce in one continuous war. Enacting punitive justice has the decided positive effect of saying the state will not tolerate such wrongdoing in the future, but it largely fails to create the conditions for a different kind of society. It can only produce its mirror opposite, of not tolerating such acts. It is in light of this that movements for restorative justice have taken on more valence in peace studies, not only in criminal justice systems, but also in thinking about the reconstruction of society as a whole. Worse, a single-minded pursuit of punitive justice can actually make long-term conditions for full reconciliation worse. A much debated point in this regard at the moment now is the warrant issued by the International Criminal Court for the arrest of the president of the Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. He is retaliated by expelling the aid agencies that are keeping more than 1 million people in Darfur alive. One of the dangers in the pursuit of justice in complex situations of wrongdoing is that the concept of justice can become exceedingly abstract and so do damage to concrete realities rather than ameliorating the conditions and direct experiences of injustice. A second and related feature of the limits of justice has to do with being able to deal with the cascading effects of long-term injustice. Wrongdoing, social sin, and all their consequences become so interlaced and entrenched in societies that they become almost impossible to eradicate. We chip away at them, as it were, either through focusing on individual injustices or by enacting structural changes that we hope will erase the conditions under which injustice continues to operate. Think, for example, of the ongoing struggle against racism in this country. 4 decades of addressing individual projects, especially in education, and enacting legislation to counteract discrimination have brought us as a nation a long way. Barack Obama would not be president today without it. Yet we are constantly reminded how much more still has to be done and the vigilance needed to keep sliding back to an earlier state. Such a realization should not make us give up on the project of justice. On the contrary, but it makes us realize how focused we need to be. We cannot achieve perfect justice. So what does that mean for the healing process within reconciliation? A third consideration about the limits of justice grows out of another thing we are learning about reconciliation. Reconciliation is about change. Now, we have long known that it involves the change of the wrongdoer and calls for a series of actions on the wrongdoer's part, such as remorse, apology, asking for forgiveness, a willingness to accept punishment or to engage in acts of expiation. But what has become clearer over time is that the victim, too, has to undergo change if there is to be a new creation. Now, I'm not talking here about blaming victims for the plight in which they find themselves. But at some point, victims also have to be willing to engage the harm that has been done them so as to secure, at the very least, a return of the agency or capacity to act that has been wrested away from them, to change their relationship to what has happened, to the deed, to the wrongdoer, and to the larger setting in which all this happened. We know that the reconstruction of life after grievous harm and irretrievable loss requires a new set of relationships to oneself, the community, to the past, and even to God. The repair of the web of meaning that situates us in a life-giving, interdependent world requires all of this. Often in the pursuit of justice, there's a sense that change is only something for the wrongdoer. If that change happens, the integrity of the victim is restored. That is, of course, too simple. It rests on the belief that grave injustice and wrongdoing can simply be erased or removed from the lives of victims without any further consequences for the victim. And the victim can then return to a kind of status quo ante and continue life as though nothing ever happened. But profound misdeeds change our lives inalterably. We cannot bring back the dead. We cannot restore a way of life and some networks of relationships that have been irretrievably taken from us. To pursue justice without regard for the change that will have to happen in the lives also of victims, then, will only eventuate in a one-sided, inadequate enactment of justice. Now, I raise these points about the limits of justice to show the limits of this kind of roadmap for achieving reconciliation. In circles where reconciliation is being pursued, inadequate and often abstract pursuits of justice can actually hamper the long-term quest for reconciliation and healing. An example here would be the 1997 meeting of the European Council of Churches in Graz, in Austria. The meeting, intended to explore reconciliation, broke down into competing lobbying groups for different causes, each one claiming that their injustices, those that they had suffered, were the most grievous and therefore had to have priority over other people's grievances. The World Council of Churches, in some of its documents at that period, had made the pursuit of justice such a central priority that it became impossible to work on any other move towards wider reconciliation short of complete justice. Miroslav Volf, one of the most sensitive students of reconciliation, pointed this out at the time. Like seeing the conversion of the individual human heart as the best roadmap to reconciliation, the pursuit of justice as yet another roadmap carries with it deep truths that we ignore at our own peril. But as the sole roadmap, it may not help us negotiate some of the terrain on the road to reconciliation. When one deals with long-term wrongdoing and the accumulation of the effects of social sin, the pursuit of justice becomes a necessary but not in itself sufficient condition for reaching reconciliation. If left only to changing the wrongdoing that has been done, and even eliminating the conditions that sustain injustice, it may not deal adequately with the other changes that must mark wrongdoers and victims alike. I saw this particularly in the situations in Eastern Europe. I worked with a group of theologians who were trying to develop a pastoral theology for these kinds of societies, and realized it was not enough to remove the injustice. What had happened to people living under those circumstances for so long is they had lost so much of their sense of agency. They were afraid to come together, to trust their neighbors, and that all had to be rebuilt. That doesn't happen naturally. So I come to a third roadmap. A third roadmap to reconciliation grows out of two sets of experiences. The first set arises from realizing the strengths and weaknesses of the two roadmaps I've just been discussing. Both roadmaps provided indispensable guideposts on the road to reconciliation, focusing upon the conversion of individual hearts and the pursuit of justice. As we have come to experience the complexity of reconciliation processes, be it in international peacemaking or dealing with the polarization within church and society, we have also become aware of the limitation of the roadmaps that can provide for all the varieties of terrain that a road to reconciliation must negotiate. Hence, the limitations have caused us to ask questions. The second set of experience has to do with what has been found to sort of work in reconciliation efforts over the past 20 years. As I've already mentioned, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in some form or another have existed at least since 1970. But it was the TRCs in Chile and South America that captured the wider imagination. Efforts at healing of memories, such as the REMI project in Guatemala, the recovery of historical memory, have also been turned to increasingly as an important avenue to national healing. The increasing attention given to processes of forgiveness constitute yet another venue for reconciliation. This leads me to propose thinking about a third kind of roadmap to achieving reconciliation, and I call it alternative social formations. Our alternative social formations are places of liminal performance, places on the boundaries. They are often highly ritualized in nature, and they provide spaces for engaging in practices that promote reconciliation. They are spaces, first of all, that are alternative, in the sense that they are not located entirely in the present, so they do more than simply accompany the victim or the wrongdoer in their present state, nor are they entirely in the past, therefore dealing with memory and the healing of memory, nor entirely in the future. In other words, imagining or engaging in utopian thinking. Rather, they are spaces that allow for movement between all three of these dimensions of time. That movement is made possible by recourse to ritual, a performance that can link these different dimensions in such a way as to make each and all of them present to us. These spaces have been identified now in recent years by thinkers in different ways. Post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha calls them third spaces, wherein reigning powers of power and domination are deconstructed and sometimes even reversed. Anthropologist Paul Rabineau speaks of what he calls interstitial zones, zones with the spaces in between, where people come out of their own bounded situations to meet one another in a place that bears some of the marks of their home territory, but is really a new place. These spaces are primarily social spaces rather than physical ones, although physical sites may become the locales for these social spaces. So we think, for example, of monuments to the dead, or public sites where profound social changes have taken place, Wenceslas Square in Prague. These spaces are constituted principally by the people who gather with the intent of enacting something relating to the process of reconciliation. They are provisional, both in the sense of temporary, but also provisional in the sense of providing something that the current social environment lacks or cannot bring forward. As such, they are primarily social rather than physical formations. Some examples. Take, for example, the Thursday demonstrations in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires by the mothers of the disappeared that continued for many years until just recently. These demonstrations of women asking where were their sons and their husbands who had been disappeared by the military initially, eventually brought down the military government in Argentina in 1983, and then continued for more than 20 years to call attention to the continuing need to pursue justice. After impunity of the wrongdoers from that so-called dirty war was lifted, these demonstrations linked the country back to the times of the wrongdoing itself. What happened was, in 1983, all the wrongdoers were given amnesty. But the children of the disappeared, many of whom had been forcibly adopted into military families, in the meantime grew up and studied law and went and filed appeals to the Supreme Court and got the amnesty overturned. And as a result, in the most recent years, those surviving members from the junta and the dirty war have been undergoing prosecution. It might be helpful here to mention other examples. I've already noted truth and reconciliation commissions. Truth and reconciliation commissions as special gatherings that suddenly open up the past, but not to dwell in the past, but to be able to move in the future. I mentioned the REMI project in Guatemala. This was a project whereby the church sent out people into all of the villages where atrocities had been committed to write down the story of what had happened. It was an immensely powerful thing, because when the document finally appeared, 2 days later, the person who presented it, the auxiliary bishop of Guatemala, Juan Gerardi, was murdered. The process, we actually repeated the process in Chicago. We have about 25,000 Guatemalan refugees, because they too, as having fled the country, needed to work with that kind of healing. But let me use some other examples. The use of healing or listening circles to help people deal with their wounds as victims. Here, victims gather in safe and hospitable places to examine their traumatic pasts and seek new narratives to tell their stories. Some of the workshops we will be experiencing tomorrow I take as examples of alternative social formations. The Racial Sobriety Project that Clarence Williams will be presenting, that combines insights from Alcoholics Anonymous to dealing with the enduring challenges of racism. Or that Peter Donayo will be leading as the national coordinator of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, as trying to provide annual meetings and other events as sites for dialogue. Building monuments to the dead, the power of the Vietnam Memorial as a place where people gather and think differently about the past. And similar monuments around the world. The monument, the Ojo que Llora in Lima, which means the eye that weeps, to all the people who died during the violence there. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all of these alternative social formations are highly formalized undertakings, such as some of those that I've mentioned. Sometimes they are moments within other activities. Think, for example, of Archbishop Tutu's exhortations to forgiveness that he gave regularly during the sessions of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the rituals that many women's groups have developed to heal themselves from abuse, to increase their own agency, and to form life-giving communities. The point of focusing upon these alternative social formations is to call attention to some important learnings about reconciliation and the road to reconciliation that the last 2 decades have given us. Attending to these alternative social formations help highlight some of these learnings. And let me try now to enumerate some of these for you. First of all, we sometimes focus inordinately on reconciliation as a goal and forget how much of it is a process. That process is not simply a means to an end. That is, something we do and then discard upon reaching the goal. It is also part of the goal itself. If reconciliation is about change in all the parties involved, that change is more than a change of mind. It has to be inscribed on our bodies. Alternative social formations are those inscribing moments. Second, even though we are speaking here of the road to reconciliation, reconciliation as a goal is rarely reached by a linear process. There are many reversals, doublings back, twists and turns, dead ends, and other vagaries along the way. The repetitive character of these alternative social formations remind us of this and embed the practices of reconciliation within the social fabric, not as a once-for-all event, but as a recurrent and, we hope, cumulative process towards an end. Another one that I'm going to talk about more tomorrow is an example of an alternative social formation started here in Boston, the Voice of the Faithful. I think this is an example of an attempt to create these sorts of possibilities. Third, this nonlinear quality of reconciliation holds not only for our spatial experience, our experience in space, but also for our experience of time as well. We find ourselves turning back to the past as our present changes. We find ourselves reimagining an already imagined future. The ritual quality of many alternative social formations help us negotiate this moving in and out of different experiences of time. Fourth, reconciliation as a goal is only partially imaginable. We cannot envision it entirely ahead of time or project the present experience into the future as such. Because of that, our experience of reconciliation is always incomplete. From a Christian point of view, we yearn for eschatological fulfillment, for that time, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, when God will be all in all. I hope these general suggestions give some idea of what I'm coming to believe is an important part of the work of reconciliation, namely, attending to the role of alternative social formations as constituent parts of the process. It gives us a different roadmap through the terrain of healing and reconciliation, having as a particular strength an appreciation of the role of the practices of reconciliation as moments of an anticipatory experience of reconciliation, as well as signposts of just how far we have come and, more importantly, still need to go. At the same time, this approach, too, has limitations. One can come to dwell in these alternative social formations as a kind of haven on a painful path and not want to leave their provisional comforts. One can become transfixed by the moments of healing in such a way as not to be willing to continue the onward journey. As a roadmap, I believe, however, these alternative social formations do change our perception of the contours of the terrain. But again, map is not territory. I'll return to this more tomorrow. But let me conclude. I return now to the title of this presentation. Is reconciliation about healing the past or building the future? In a road that is as much marked by paradox as any other trope, the answer to this either-or question is yes. Both are essential dimensions. To be sure, depending on the terrain that needs to be traversed, there may be more emphasis on one than the other. Thus, for example, for the generation that has experienced acute loss and trauma, the past may be preeminent. But for their children and grandchildren, trying to be faithful to the experience of their parents and grandparents, the future, nonetheless, will be the preoccupation. We can see this going on right now in the country, in Miami, with the question of how to deal with Fidel Castro. After years of the first generation saying we will have nothing to do, now the Cuban American Foundation itself has said, no, we've got to open to a different approach. that builds towards the future. It's a prime example of what I'm talking about. One of the questions that made me think about this past and future was posed some time ago, and this is also one that I will return to tomorrow. In the 1990s, did we turn to looking at the past, that dimension of reconciliation, because we had become so disillusioned by utopian thinking, by the collapse of utopian ideals, not only those of Marxist humanism, for example, but others? And so we thought the way to the future is to deal with the past, which is not as strange as it seems. In most collective societies, that's how you do it. In many of those societies, there's no future tense in verbs, because the future only happens by dealing with the past. So tomorrow, I want to return to these questions in more detail and look at how a community of reconciliation must be such that it is at once a community of memory and a community of hope. The nature of wounds that wrongdoing wreaks upon the human heart and the human community, given those, no single dimension will suffice for their entire healing. Healing is something that must embrace all the dimensions of the human condition and the human journey. Map is not territory. The territory in the past 20 years has become clearer to us. And the maps that we had and the maps that we are now devising, we hope, will help us negotiate that territory better for ourselves and especially for coming generations. Thank you very much.